Imagine this: a single prompt, multiple camera angles, seamless transitions, native audio with perfect lip sync, realistic physics, hands gripping objects firmly, characters embracing without distortion, all in up to 15 seconds of stunning 4K clarity. This isn't a high-budget film set. This isn't months of post-production. This is Kling 3.0, the breakthrough where AI video finally becomes true cinema. On February 5th, 2026, Kuaishou Technology officially launched Kling 3.0, a unified multimodal series that includes Video 3.0, Video 3.0 Omni, Image 3.0, and Image 3.0 Omni. They call it the era of the AI director, and for good reason. For years, AI video tools gave us impressive single shots, beautiful but fragmented. Characters shifted appearances, scenes lacked flow, audio had to be added later, often breaking the illusion. Kling 3.0 changes everything by building on a new multimodal visual language framework. It combines video, image, audio, and storytelling into one seamless engine. Here's what makes it revolutionary: multi-shot storytelling. Define up to 6 connected scenes in one prompt. The AI handles pacing, camera movements, and smooth transitions automatically. Wide establishing shots flowing into intimate close-ups, just like a real director. Unbreakable consistency. Faces, clothing, environments, and objects stay locked across every frame and shot. No more morphing hands or disappearing details. Native audio integration, built-in dialogue, sound effects, and music with realistic lip sync, spatial audio, and emotional tone. It supports multiple languages, dialects, and accents right out of the box. Advanced realism and control. Dynamic camera work. Pans, zooms, macro close-ups. Physics-aware interactions that feel natural. Hugs, fights, objects held convincingly. Up to 15 seconds of continuous 4K video. And the Omni variants, they accept multimodal inputs, mixed text, images, and even audio references for even finer control. Early creators are already hailing it as the most advanced AI video release ever. Product ads look broadcast ready. Short narratives feel like mini-films. Complex actions hold together flawlessly. While official early access is exclusive to Ultra subscribers on the Kling platform, the fastest way to dive in right now, with unlimited generations, is through Higgsfield.ai. Thanks to an exclusive Day Zero partnership, Higgsfield offers full Kling 3.0 access, complete with pro tools like editable timelines, elements for locking characters, cinematic presets, and more. They're even running a limited time 70% off on premium plans to celebrate the launch. This isn't just another update, it's a fundamental shift. AI video is no longer about generating clips, it's about directing stories, filmmakers, marketers, creators. The power to turn pure imagination into polished, consistent sounding footage is here today. Kling 3.0 on Higgsfield isn't the distant future. It's happening right now. Head over to Higgsfield.ai and start creating. Because the real question isn't, can AI make professional video? It's, what story will you direct first? If this excites you, drop a like, comment your first Kling 3.0 idea below, and subscribe for more deep dives into the future of AI creativity.